Good morning and welcome to today's roadcast. As you'll have gathered, I am not outside today. It's a little bit windy and given the limitations of my equipment, it's best for me not to be out in the wind. So for today at least, I am in the comfort of my study at home in the city of Nottingham. Before I begin, I'd like to thank each and every individual who has very kindly sent me a donation over the last few weeks via the Buy Me a Coffee button, which is located on my website. Those donations are greatly appreciated and they do indeed help, not just with the costs of running the Rogue Mail site, but also with my day-to-day expenses as I travel through this construct. I'd also like to thank each and every one of those who's taken out a paid subscription at my Substack platform, well, I say my platform, at the Substack platform, where I can be found as MOD800. Today's episode is provisionally entitled Mind Bending and Intelligence Gathering. In some respects, we are players in a great game of hide and seek. This is the nature of these lives which we have. Last spring, I released a roadcast in which I posited the view that, whatever this role may be, we're each of us involved in a game of hiding and finding. Each of us has things we wish to hide or to keep secret from others. Each of us has a curiosity that sends us seeking answers to questions that have occurred to us. This simple tenet applies to all things. Hence, we have the adage, seek and ye shall find. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a famous story published originally in 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson writes of the narrator, "If he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek." Stevenson puts forward the view that each of us exists with the capacity for good and evil. With every day, and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to the truth, by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. Stevenson is writing here of a duality of nature that is to be found in each of us. In other words, where there is light, there is also dark. Each of us has the capacity for good, each of us has the capacity for evil. He states, all human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil. And Edward Hyde, alone, in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. So the first question is, what does our intelligence make of this? Let's begin by considering just what the word intelligence means. It's a noun from the late 14th century, quote, the highest faculty of the mind, capacity for comprehending general truths. A point that needs to be made at this juncture is one which I made in last week's roadcast, namely that when we talk about mind, we should understand that mind is non-local. Mind is not located in the physical, biological brain, but rather it is connected, it exists as a kind of universal mind or an informed field, which we are, to varying degrees of success, able to tap into. In other words, to receive downloads of information from. Faculty of understanding, comprehension, from Old French intelligence, 12th century, and directly from Latin intelligentia, meaning understanding, knowledge, power of discerning, art, skill, taste, which in itself is from intelligentum, meaning discerning, appreciative, present participle of intelligere, to understand, comprehend, come to know. This is from assimilated form of inter, between, plus legere, choose, pick out, read, from the root leg, to gather, to collect, with derivatives meaning to speak, to pick out words. Given the non-locality of the mind, then intelligence may be defined as the ability to discern truths from the information, also known as the grammar, received by the brain from the informed field. Intelligence, then, is the capacity to comprehend general truths. In the story, the character of Dr. Jekyll is personified thus. From both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to the truth. Here, it appears to me that Stevenson is evidently suggesting that intelligence is dualistic. In other words, that it is only founded in the moral and the intellectual. Whilst I acknowledge that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is but a work of fiction, and that for the purposes of the narrative of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this is necessary, I do wonder if this precludes the other possibilities of intelligence being intuitive. After all, how often do we find that our first impressions of an individual or a subject turn out to be accurate? By which I mean, when you meet someone for the first time, and this is true of all of us, there is only one opportunity to create a good first impression. We judge people, in other words, we glean some understanding of them from the various clues that come to us via their avatar, the form of their avatar, through their speech, their dress, their actions, their facial expressions, and all the rest of it. And sometimes we get this sense that they've created a favourable impression, or we may conversely take an instant dislike to someone. In both cases, we are using our intuition, and it's often a sense that you get in your gut, a feeling that you have in your gut. That, for the purposes of today's roadcast, is a good working definition of what intuition means. And he doesn't really mention, in his story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, he doesn't introduce that as a possibility. But as I read it, and as I look back over some of the quotations from the story, it's a thought that does occur to me. Is Stevenson precluding intuition as also being part and parcel of our intelligence, our ability to discern and to gather truths? Sometimes these first impressions can be wrong. We could have been tricked. There could have been some kind of deception going on. You may find out, for instance, that you get a good feeling towards someone, and then at a later stage you find out that they are engaged in fraud, for instance, or some kind of criminal activity, which completely negates that first impression. Your first impression was wrong. But if we are paying attention, we'll often find that our first impressions are most accurate. And I would regard this as a key component of this intelligence which I'm talking about. At this point, it may be necessary to remind the reader or the listener that I am of the view that what we take to be our own thoughts do not emanate from the brain, but rather exist outside us, and that our brain is simply able to receive the information, if you like, to download the information, or to receive it in the way a radio receiver will tune into airwaves, radio waves, and then act as an antenna that broadcasts the words and the music, whatever it is that is coming through the radio waves. The conscious individual comes to know that nothing comes from his brain, but that the brain receives his ideas and imaginings from the informed field, and that his connection to that informed field is improved by his being conscious of himself as a spirit, someone who is sojourning through this realm inside a bio-avatar that may not ultimately even belong to him. Stevenson suggests that Jekyll is limited by his individual intelligence and that this may be applied to each and every one of us. He writes, "All human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde alone in the ranks of mankind was pure evil." And yet, Stevenson also wrote in his essay Lay Morals that, "So long as we love, we serve. So long as we are loved by others, I would almost say that we are indispensable, and no man is useless while he has a friend." In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson shows himself to be well aware of man's true nature and his existence in this realm, a construct that is most likely a simulacrum. "I began to perceive more deeply than it has ever yet been stated the trembling immateriality, the mist-like transience of this seemingly so solid body in which we walk attired." What I like about that is that Stevenson is there touching precisely on the truth, that these bodies that we have are essentially our vehicles through which we travel through this realm. And he senses that. And, it's often been said that people have insights and they come to knowledge through illness. And it's also to be noted that Robert Louis Stevenson was unhealthy for much of his life, being plagued by an illness that eventually resulted in him moving to the South Pacific, namely the island of Samoa, to alleviate its symptoms. As I recall, the illness was largely of a respiratory nature. And as I say, bouts of ill health are certainly conducive to a more lucid view of individual existence as a beguiling and convincing dream in which we believe ourselves to be awake. And he also had a great sense of humour. Largely bedridden, Stevenson described himself as living like a weevil in a biscuit. Our intelligence is necessarily limited until we apply our common sense to an issue. The individual is of the view that he's actually just simply a combination of this duality of good and evil. Then he will become that, whether he is correct or whether he is wrong. Because he is thinking that, and he believes that, that is what he will become. So intelligence is an interesting word, and we note also that we have the intelligence services. We have words like intelligence gathering, intel drops, and intelligence officers. And you do wonder what they mean precisely by the word intelligence. If it is the ability to discern, to gather information and from that discern general truths, we may well be able to tap into intelligence sources. We may well be able to gather the information as we seek to uncover the truth. But is that enough? Is that enough, or do we need to apply something else? Do we need to use other tools in order to get to the truth, to the heart of the matter? I would argue we do, and it is the trivium that we can use in order to do just that, in order to find the truth of the matter. Remember, the trivium is the three ways. We have grammar, which for the purposes of this discussion means information or data. We have logic, which is man's innate ability to reason. And we have rhetoric, which is the third equal strand of the trivium, whereby that individual is able to articulate to a proficient and truthful level his application of the trivium to a particular subject. In other words, the trivium is such a powerful tool, for it is one which utilises the individual's natural proclivity towards elucidating the truth of a matter. So let's dig into the subject of Elon Musk and his promotion of his SpaceX narrative, which necessarily involves the notion that we can travel through space and colonize Mars within 20 to 30 years, a statement he made just last week. So, if we take that is the subject then. Elon Musk's promotion of his SpaceX narrative and the notion that we can travel through space. The first part then is the grammar, which is the who, what, when, and where of the matter. In order to truly believe in space existing as a reality, it's necessary to examine the information. Who, historically, has put forward the view that space travel is a possibility? Let's just deal with the last 125 years or so. And a prominent figure in the early development of what you might call this notion of space travel was the writer H.G. Wells, particularly in his books, The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. On top of which, flowing out from that, we have myriad science fiction films and books of the last 100 years plus. Sci-fi has become very, very popular, but I would argue that it was seeded some 125 years ago. If we consider all the sci-fi films that have been released over that time, there are certain key players whose names stand out. For example, Steven Spielberg, Stanley Kubrick, Gene Roddenberry, who was the writer of Star Trek, George Lucas and his Star Wars franchise, and then we have the likes of the BBC, which in fact till this day, from 1960 or so, has been producing the Doctor Who series. And on top of that, we have, of course, NASA, which was founded by those Nazi scientists that were imported at the end of Second World War as a part of Operation Paperclip. So the proof that is the proof in inverted commas that is put forward to us is the presentation of the astronauts. And if you look into the reality of all these astronauts that have been promoted into public consciousness over the last nearly 60 plus years, you will see that maybe it is obviously it's just a coincidence that many of them are, if not all of them, are Freemasons. But they are presented performing all kinds of tasks in what, for the discerning viewer, is clearly a film set. When we're talking about who is putting forward the view that space travel is a possibility, you have that long list of film directors and also many science fiction writers who have been promoting science fiction over the last 100 plus years. And since H.G. Wells started figuring large in the infancy of this development in sci-fi as a popular literature and film genre, then it's been rolled out via mass printing of newspapers and books, magazines, but arguably the most significant rollout of the sci-fi narrative and how it has become seeded in the imaginations of the populace is through films and TV programs that portray the fantasy and trick the viewer into accepting it all as possible. The sheer number of sci-fi films is taken as evidence of this being a mass thought control program. What are they each promoting? Whether it's H.G. Wells, Stanley Kubrick, George Lucas, or a writer of the BBC Doctor Who series, what is it they're actively promoting by releasing these programs, these films, and bringing them to the attention of the public? All of this has led to it being seeded in the imaginations of the populace by films and TV programs that portray the fantasy and trick the viewer into accepting it all as possible. The sheer number of sci-fi films is taken as evidence of this being a mass thought control program. They are promoting the notion that stars and planets are real and that we are on a globe, a ball spinning through a galaxy at great speed. That we are travelling around the sun. What do they cite as proof of space travel? Well, you've got from in the late 50s, 60s, you have the footage and the documentation of the cosmonauts of the Soviet Union's voyages into space, with Yuri Gagarin largely being at the head of it. And from that were produced whole volumes of photographs, films of astronauts in zero gravity, footage of space rockets and their purported landing. To where do the believers claim man has travelled in space? Remember, at this point we are specifically at the grammar part of the Trivium, with its application to this notion of Elon Musk's SpaceX. The Apollo moon landing of 1969 and each of the subsequent missions are invariably cited as proof that mankind has landed on the moon. However, a cursory look at this cited proof reveals it to be nothing more than a cinematic Psy-Op filmed, most probably by Stanley Kubrick. Interestingly, a year before the claimed landing of the Apollo mission on the moon in 1969, the BBC put out a film called The Newsbenders, and in that, the Donald Pleasance character, who's effectively a agent of and a controller working for the secret services, I would hazard a guess it being MI5, shows the other protagonist a film set, a model film set of a lunar surface with a model rocket and all the background details you would expect of such a set. It reveals such a film set a year before the landing on the lunar surface. Now, if we spin forward to 2025, we have the continuance of the same fake narrative in the form of Elon Musk's SpaceX agency and his claim that mankind will be able to colonize Mars in 20 to 30 years. We're also fed the fantasy of the International Space Station, nonsensical footage of astro women with their hair on end to simulate zero gravity. And it's also to be noted that NASA only publishes composite images of the globe, CGIs of the world in which the clouds never shift. And on top of that, dubious photographs, again, most likely composites and CGI, AI creations of the stars and the planets. At this point, I'd like to ask this question. How can the critical thinker ignore these anomalies? I was going to call this part How I Became a Conspiracy Theorist. I'm not entirely sure it's appropriate, but I just want to bring this in as an interesting adjunct because I am so old that in July 1969, when the purported moon landing happened, I was some 4 years and 7 months old. And I recall it very clearly, as if it was yesterday, the particular day I was watching what was being presented to the public via the television as genuine footage of these astronauts doing their thing and walking on the moon and having a phone call with Richard Nixon when he picks up a landline in his office. And I mean, I look at it now and I find it hilarious that people have swallowed for this nonsense. But back in, on that July day specifically, when I was but 4.5, I clearly remember that it was a beautiful and exceptionally sunny day. And at our house in Huddersfield, the lounge faced south. So on days like that, when the sun was beaming into the front room, the curtains had to be drawn if you wanted to see the television screen. And I can remember watching the purported moon landing as it was shown on our black and white television and thinking how unimpressive it was. I was so unimpressed by it, in fact, that I decided after but a few minutes that none of it was worthy of my attention any longer. And so I turned the TV off, opened the curtains, and simply went outside where I'd rather be. I decided I'd rather be playing outside. So I essentially stopped watching it and stepped out into the beauty of the day. And that, looking back, was my first impression of sci-fi, of the space narrative. I was disinterested that my own sphere of existence, if you like, my own world was a lot closer and for me far more interesting than these black and white images that I was being, and millions of people around the world were being shown on their television sets. It may not surprise the listener, but thereafter I never had any real or lasting interest in the subject of sci-fi. I went with my family to see the Star Wars film, which I think was released in 1978 at the Classic Cinema in Huddersfield. But I never bothered with any of the subsequent episodes. I've just really never been captivated by it or particularly interested in it. And now, after all these decades in this realm, I've reached the conclusion it is nothing more, nothing less than an adult fantasy that's been promulgated, seeded into the minds of multiple generations over the last 125 years. So all those points I made there, all those data points concerning the grammar, the who, what, when and where of the matter, form the first part of the Trivium. The second part of the Trivium and of this examination of Musk's SpaceX narrative is that of logic, in other words, reasoning. This is where we delve into the how and why of the matter. For instance, how has the Sci-Fi-Psy-Op, I'm going to call it the Sci-Fi-Psy-Op, how has it been promulgated? Well, as I've already said, it was promulgated through the dark cinematic arts of film and television, a programming of a false narrative that begins in the childhood and bombards the individual throughout his life. Why? What is the purpose of this promotion, this seeding of a fake space narrative? Could it be that it's to keep mankind distracted and thus ignorant of his true self and the nature of the world in which he appears to live? Could it be that to sever the divine connection of each individual spirit to his ultimate creator? To disable and nullify the individual threat to the Freemasonic sorcerers and controllers that would arise were the individual able to break free of the mental shackles that tie him to the dungeon programming. That's an expression coined by Jason Brashears of archaics.com. I think it's brilliant. The dungeon programming. In other words, like Plato's cave, it's the way, the importance of controlling the minds of the individuals in a mental construct that you wish to control is huge and of great significance. The how and the why are established through this process that we're following here. And that leads us on to the next of the three elements of the Trivium, namely rhetoric. By way of example, I'm going to put forward some rhetoric here. You can see how it follows and flows naturally from the two other aspects of the Trivium, from the information, the grammar, through the logic, where we apply our reasoning, to this point now, where I attempt to put that which we've gathered, that intelligence which has been gathered, distill it down to its essence, and to provide, by way of my spoken voice, a rhetorical content that summarises that which has been uncovered by this process. By way of the falsified space narrative, by the seeding and promulgation of the false notion that life is meaningless, as we are but carbon-based life forms spinning on a ball through a galaxy, and by way of the relentless propaganda attached to it all, The controllers, or mind benders, are able to place individual minds into virtual prisons where the walls that contain the individual's mind are invisible. The space narrative has served the controllers by effectively placing an imaginary astronaut's helmet on the head of the deceived. Not only is it a kind of goldfish bowl for his mind, but it also for his head, or remember, it's a way of cutting off his connection to the informed field. That's what I'm meaning here by it being a goldfish bowl for his mind. But it also works as a shaken snow dome, the particles of which further confuse and obscure that individual's already limited perception of his self and his existence. My conclusion, therefore, is that the space narrative is essentially a mind construct designed to entrap, to imprison the individual in a cave of his own limited intelligence. Is it not the case that this being a perceived reality is entirely of the mind? In a perceived reality, all is mind. Thus, those who seek to control the profane, the goyim, and the infidel, those who view the masses as but chattels, as monsters and slaves, to whom and through which they can do exactly what they wish to do, in culling the herd with a demonstrably widespread genocide by needlepoint, for instance. Those who wish to control the masses use the space narrative as an effective means of mind control, of mass mind control. Another significant benefit for the would-be controllers is the huge financial opportunities that also accrue via the funneling of taxes and monies into NASA and, in this case, SpaceX. To return then to where I began with Robert Louis Stevenson's novella Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, here's another excellent quotation which pertains exactly to what I've been talking about today, namely this game of hide and seek, this perpetual curiosity that we have as individuals, a curiosity to uncover the truth, but also simultaneously at play we have this aspect to us that is seeking to hide certain elements of ourselves. In other words, we're all engaged in a game of hide and seek. But this curiosity, for me, it necessarily involves intelligence gathering, right? And what better way to control people than to be able to insert false intelligence into their minds and for them to believe the fake science behind it. In other words, that we can travel to the moon, that we have done it already, even though NASA now tells us the blueprints, the documents that show how the various aspects of the vehicles that took us to the moon have been lost. You know, it doesn't take long for an individual to come along and to take a look at some of these things that I've spoken about today, which I've touched on before, that reveal the space narrative to be completely naked, to be, as I say, an adult fantasy. An adult fantasy, the promulgation of which serves the mind benders, the mind controllers, very well indeed. If you're an individual who's imbued with a natural curiosity, a curiosity that interestingly we find most prevalent in young children, then you'll appreciate this quote. You start a question and it's like starting a stone. You sit quietly on the top of a hill and away the stone goes, starting others. So with that thought, I'm going to leave it there today. Thank you very much for listening to today's roadcast. If you're feeling particularly appreciative, then please consider chucking me a few quid into the pot via the Buy Me a Coffee button. If you like and use the Substack platform, then please consider taking out a paid subscription. All donations, all subscriptions are greatly appreciated. And even if you're not feeling appreciative, then please at least take out an email subscription, either at Substack, where you can read my work for free. You just won't get it on the day it's published. And please, if you haven't done so already, subscribe at my website, roguemail.org, to the email list. And that way you'll receive notifications of any discourse, of any essay which I'm putting out. And so, on this Mothering Sunday, or so they tell us according to the Pope's work schedule, all that remains for me to say is thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you got something from it. And until the next time, I'll catch you on the flip side. Cheers.